Are you really smirking at an old patch while a coffee urn hisses in the corner? They mocked him in that canteen line, pressed by their own assumptions, never noticing how his silence steadied the room. Still, when that faded patch caught the morning light, a hush fell so clean you could hear a heartbeat between breaths, proof of a life lived in quiet service. But quiet men leave echoes too, and that worn patch remembers more than any of them ever saw. The canteen always woke before the rest of the town. Metal trays clinked in slow rhythm, coffee urns hissed and sighed, and the smell of buttered toast drifted beneath the low hum of early chatter. Henry Cole stepped into line with the kind of quiet presence that blended into the warm morning air rather than cutting through it. He carried his tray carefully, as though noise itself were something he preferred not to disturb. A cluster of younger patrons turned just enough to notice him. Their eyes dropped to the faded shoulder patch on his old work jacket, sun-bleached at the edges, threads loosened with years of use. One of them smirked, elbowing the other. A whisper followed the sort that wasn't meant to be heard, but always was. Henry didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight and allowed a woman rushing to work to step in front of him. "You go ahead," he said gently, the words soft enough to warm the air around them. Lucas, the small 11-year-old who came in most mornings before school, noticed everything from his table near the window. He watched the exchange, watched the smirk, and watched the man behind the tray respond with the kind of dignity most people only pretended to understand. Lucas swung his legs beneath his chair, eyes narrowing in that way children do when they're trying to make sense of grown-up unfairness. When Henry reached the counter, the server, already juggling too many orders, looked up just long enough to frown. "Sir, you're in the wrong line again," she said, not unkindly, but too loudly. Heads turned, a couple of eyebrows lifted. Henry blinked a brief, gentle pause, then offered a small apology, even though he'd been standing exactly where the sign told him to. He stepped aside, tray steady in his hands, letting someone else slide past him with an impatient breath. But the room wasn't done testing him yet. He chose a small table near the wall, far from the crush of conversations. The chair creaked softly beneath him, familiar and predictable. He stirred his coffee, watching the swirl of cream settle into a calm, even color. Across the room, the same young patrons laughed again, lighter this time, but still tethered to whatever they thought they saw when they looked at him. Lucas rose from his seat, curiosity guiding his steps. He carried a half-finished chocolate milk, gripping it with both hands. "Mr. Cole," he asked quietly. Henry looked up, offering a small smile. "Morning, Lucas." The boy's gaze dropped to the faded patch. "What's that from?" he asked. "It looks important." Henry tapped the patch once with a fingertip, almost as if it might wake something he preferred stayed asleep. "Just an old thing," he said. "Nothing worth talking about." Lucas didn't believe that for a second, but he nodded anyway, retreating to his table with the kind of thoughtful silence only children manage naturally. The canteen door swung open, letting in a rush of warmer air and a few more customers. Henry straightened his jacket, smoothing the worn stitches along the patch. For a moment he wondered how many more mornings he would sit quietly in this corner, letting the town decide who he was before he ever said a word. Still, he lifted his coffee, breathed in its steadiness, and chose once again not to answer the room, but to outlast it. The lunch crowd drifted in with the slow, unhurried rhythm of early afternoon. Sunlight pressed through the canteen windows in soft gold bands, settling over the tables like a warm, familiar blanket. Henry chose a small two-seater near the far wall where the light caught the steam rising from his bowl of soup and turned it into a pale ribbon. He ate quietly, savoring each bite the way men who have lived through long seasons tend to do, steady, unrushed, grateful for the simple warmth of a meal. The low chatter around him rolled like a distant tide, calm enough that he could almost forget the awkwardness of the morning. Almost. Carla swept past with a handful of menus, her voice sharp but distracted. "Who keeps taking up these corner tables? We've got a rush coming." Her eyes landed on Henry before she realized what she'd done. A few customers glanced in his direction, curiosity tightening into mild judgment. She didn't mean harm, she rarely did, but the words stayed in the air longer than she intended. Henry offered a small nod that let her off the hook, but the flush of embarrassment crept up anyway. He folded his receipt carefully, half then, half again, the same way he used to at the town post office when he paid bills in person. The motion calmed him, the rhythm of it, a habit that steadied his hands. Across the room, Lucas slid off his chair and wandered over with his chocolate milk in tow. He stood beside Henry's table for a moment, rocking slightly on his heels. "Sir, what's that patch from?" he asked, pointing at the worn shoulder of Henry's jacket. Henry set down his spoon, letting the steam fade between them. "Just an old thing," he said. "Nothing important. But it looks like it means something." Lucas insisted, his voice soft but sure. Henry smiled gently. "Some things don't need telling, kiddo." Lucas lowered his eyes, realizing he had pressed a little too far. But curiosity glowed in him, like a steady lantern, one that wouldn't go out just because someone told it to. He wandered back to his table, still glancing over now and then, trying to understand a man who seemed made of quiet edges and deeper stories. Henry finished his soup and stood to refill his coffee. On the way back to his seat, he paused near the old hot water dispensers tucked beside the counter. Its metal casing rattled with a faint, uneven buzz, an off-kilter hum that only someone familiar with aging machines would notice. He leaned slightly, listening. The sound told him enough the heating element wasn't connecting right. The same issue used to happen in the old maintenance room at the postal center. A tiny adjustment, barely the turn of a screw, could fix it. But this wasn't his space, and stepping in unasked had never been his way. Still, that little boy kept watching. Henry returned to his table, fingers brushing the edge of his worn patch as he sat down. Outside the window, a school bus rolled by its bright color, cutting a gentle line across the quiet afternoon. He took a breath deep and steady, reminding himself that sometimes silence was the better choice, at least, until someone truly needed his voice. And for the moment, the room simply wasn't ready to ask. The community hall sat at the edge of Market Street, a wide, echoing space with sun-worn floors and banners from past charity dinners hung proudly along the rafters. By mid-afternoon, volunteers were already busy stacking chairs, unfolding tables, sorting canned goods into neat rows for the Veterans Day fundraiser. The scent of floor polish mixed with the faint sweetness of donated pies cooling in their boxes. Henry stood at the doorway for a moment, hands resting loosely in his jacket pockets. The hum of activity felt louder than usual. Voices clipped steps, quick patience thin. He hesitated, unsure whether stepping inside would help or only add another body to the growing tension. Then he walked in. Boxes lined the hallway leading toward the kitchen, each labeled in marker. A few volunteers rushed past him, frustration painted plainly across their faces. Carla stood in the middle of the room, her hair pulled back too tightly, her clipboard tucked beneath one arm, as if it were the only thing holding her upright. "The inventory system is down again," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough that everyone could hear. "If we can't track what's missing, we're going to have to close this whole thing down. I swear, this place runs on duct tape and prayers." A few people exchanged worried looks. Veterans Day was important to the town. Closing now would be more than an inconvenience. It would feel like failing neighbors they genuinely wanted to honor. Henry stepped closer, kneeling to gather a handful of dropped plastic utensils someone had knocked over. "Need a hand?" he asked softly. Carla exhaled. If someone knows how to make that ancient computer behave, yes. He set the utensils on a nearby table, his expression warm but reserved. I'm not much help with computers these days, but I can carry things. She didn't thank him, but her shoulders eased a little as he bent to lift a box of tablecloths. He moved with deliberate gentleness, the same way he'd approached everything that mattered quietly, without asking for space or praise. Near the back of the hall, a man in a light jacket stepped inside. Hale, tall, calm, the kind of presence that settled a room without ever needing to raise his voice. Folks in town knew him as the community safety coordinator, but the older residents remembered something else about him, something unspoken but respected. His years with the Navy SEALs weren't something he advertised, though the discipline in the way he carried himself often said enough. He noticed the tension immediately. "Rough day?" he asked Carla, voice steady. You could say that she muttered, "If we don't solve this inventory mess, we're sunk." Hale scanned the room, his eyes moving over the volunteers, the boxes, the blinking monitor in the corner. Then they landed briefly on Henry on the faded shoulder patch, half hidden beneath his jacket sleeve. Something flickered in Hale's expression, a quiet recognition, but he didn't mention it. Henry caught the glance, unsure what to make of it. He finished folding a stack of dish towels and carried them to the kitchen. A glass jar sat by the window, its handwritten label reading, "Tips for Supplies." Carla tapped it absent-mindedly as she passed the coins inside, rattling just enough to remind everyone how tight their budget always ran. Henry noticed the gesture, the small hope behind it, and placed a few crumpled bills inside without drawing attention. The hall buzzed with voices and clattering trays. Henry paused in the center of the room, watching the swirl of activity, the way volunteers moved between hope and frustration with every passing minute. He let the noise wash over him, grounding himself the way only someone accustomed to chaotic spaces could. Then everything paused, as if the hall inhaled. For one long breath, no one moved. It was the kind of stillness that arrives just before something shifts, before tension decides whether it will break or settle into something steadier. Henry didn't know it yet, but the moment was already bending toward him, waiting to draw him into the story the room had begun to write. The second crash hit harder than the first. One moment, the inventory screen flickered. The next it went dark entirely, taking with it the fragile order everyone had spent the afternoon building. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall, questions, blame, worry, blending into a rising hum that made the room feel smaller than it was. Carla threw her clipboard onto a table. "That's it," she said, voice strained. "We can't run a dinner without knowing what we have. We might as well cancel before people show up and see the mess." The volunteers froze. No one wanted to be the one to agree, and no one wanted to argue either. The tension pushed in from all sides, heavy enough that some stepped back without realizing it. Hale stepped forward, his expression calm but focused. He scanned the room, taking in every detail, the unplugged cords, the concerned faces, the blinking lights on the power strip that begged for someone to see what was wrong. Then his eyes settled on Henry. "Mind giving it a look?" Hale asked quietly. "Only if you want." Henry felt every gaze turn toward him. It wasn't the attention that made him hesitate. It was the years of being overlooked, dismissed, assumed to be something smaller than he was. Protocol slammed him harder than any door ever could, but he stayed steady. He let out a slow breath and reached up, brushing his jacket aside. The movement was simple, almost absent-minded, but it revealed the entire patch on his shoulder, the faded emblem threads, worn thin edges softened by time. Silence rippled outward like a dropped pebble in still water. Hale's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. "I know that patch," he murmured. "Crisis coordination, cross-team response. That was serious work. A few volunteers leaned closer, not daring to interrupt. Henry gave a modest shake of his head. Just did what needed doing. But Hale understood more than Henry intended to reveal. Years of navigating emergencies had taught him how to read a person, how to see the history woven into the quiet places they tried to hide. And the faded patch wasn't just cloth. It was a record of service few ever knew existed. Hale, a former SEAL officer who had seen enough to respect even the smallest acts done well, straightened his stance. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand in a symbolic salute. Not military, not ceremonial, something simpler, warmer. A gesture of respect one neighbor gives another when words aren't enough. The entire hall fell silent. Carla's expression softened first, then crumbled under the weight of understanding. No one smirked. No one whispered. They just watched. Henry really watched him, as though seeing him for the first time. Henry stepped toward the darkened monitor. He crouched beside the tower, fingers brushing the power connection. 2 cables had shaken loose when someone tried to move a box earlier. He reconnected them, pressed the reset button, and waited. A low hum filled the space. The screen flickered back to life. Then the inventory system returned steady, bright whole. A cheer rose soft at first, then spreading as relief loosened every tense shoulder in the room. Henry stood, dusting his hands on his jacket, hoping the moment would pass quickly. But gratitude has a sound, and the room finally heard it. Word spread quickly through the hall, faster than news usually traveled in their small town. Volunteers who had been fretting over table placements or pie counts now drifted toward Henry, with softened expressions, each carrying a different shape of apology. A few reached out their hands, offering firm, grateful shakes. Others simply touched his arm or nodded deeply, letting him know the shift in their hearts without needing any words. Henry took each gesture with the same humility he'd shown all afternoon. He didn't rush. He didn't lean into the attention. He just stood quietly, receiving gratitude, the way some people receive sunlight, with gentle surprise, unsure they deserve its warmth. Carla approached last. Her steps were small, at first hesitant, as if unsure whether she even had the right to cross the space between them. The clipboard she always carried hung limply at her side. She stopped a foot away from him, eyes fixed somewhere near his shoelaces. "I misjudged you," she said softly. "I thought you were... Well, I thought wrong." Henry offered her an easy smile. "Long day. Happens to the best of us." She shook her head. "No. This one's on me." Before she could say more, Hale joined them. The former SEAL officer moved with the same steady composure he always carried, though today there was a quiet pride woven into his expression. He held a small town-issued camera in one hand. Henry Hale asked gently, "Would it be all right if I photographed your patch? The town service archive keeps records of people who've helped hold this community together. That patch belongs there." Henry looked genuinely stunned. "It's nothing special." "It mattered to a lot of folks," Hale replied. "Still does." Carla nodded. "More than we realized." Henry hesitated, fingertips brushing the worn threads on his shoulder. Then he nodded once, almost shyly. Hale lifted the camera and snapped a single photo, no flash, no fuss, just a quiet moment captured in warm, late-afternoon light, the kind that felt honest. Lucas rushed over before Henry could sit down again. The boy's eyes were bright wide, the kind of awe-filled look only a child can give without embarrassment. "Sir Lucas said everyone's talking about your patch." Henry chuckled softly. "Guess I'm overdue for a clean jacket anyway." Lucas grinned. "No, don't change it. It looks brave." Henry ruffled the boy's hair gently. It just looks old, kiddo. Old can be brave, Lucas replied, shrugging as if it were obvious. More people passed by, whispering small pieces of gratitude. That faded patch. We were so wrong. I didn't know he was one of those who helped during the storms. Why didn't he say anything? He never had to. Look at him. Henry heard fragments of the conversations, but he didn't let them rest too deeply. Praise felt like a coat. He wasn't quite used to wearing warm, yes, but unfamiliar. Instead, he watched Hale quietly direct volunteers back into motion, saw Carla wipe her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, and noticed Lucas trailing him with a kind of protective attention, as if the boy were guarding a secret he didn't fully understand yet. The dinner began to take shape again, tables being straightened, pies carried to the serving counter, strings of lights flickering back to life. The hall regained its pulse. Henry stepped back, observing everything as though from the edge of a photograph. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't expected it either. Service in his world was something done quietly, because it needed doing, not because someone might later applaud. Yet the town was changing around him, softening, shifting, learning, something about itself that it hadn't known that morning. And in that moment of renewed motion and gentle chatter, Henry felt a subtle tug, an early echo of something still on its way. Yet something bigger was already forming for tomorrow. The foyer of the community center glowed in late afternoon sunlight, warm and tender, the kind of light that made dust particles drift like slow, thoughtful snow. Folding chairs formed a small semicircle, and townspeople filled them with quiet anticipation. No stage, no microphones, just the soft echo of footsteps and the faint scent of floor wax warming under the sun. At the center of the room, beneath a framed photograph of the old Market Street parade, stood a new display easel. On it hung a simple wooden frame, polished but modest. Inside, carefully mounted on linen backing, was the faded shoulder patch that had traveled farther and endured more than most people in the room would ever know. Henry stood off to the side, unsure where to put his hands. He smoothed his jacket, then clasped his fingers behind him, then settled for resting them lightly at his sides. He had lived enough quiet years to feel comfortable in stillness, yet today's quiet felt different, charged, almost reverent. Hale stepped forward. The room recognized him instantly, the steady posture, the calm intensity softened by kindness. As the former SEAL officer looked around, the crowd hushed even further. Funny Hale began, his voice low and warm. We smirked at that faded patch once. He paused, letting the memory settle. Several people lowered their eyes, but a SEAL officer showed us what it really meant. A murmur traveled through the room, some apology, some gratitude, all sincerity. Henry stayed still, eyes on the frame. He didn't seem embarrassed, only humbled, as if taking in the moment with the same careful patience he brought to everything else. Lucas edged closer, hands tucked into the pockets of his too big jacket. He stared at the framed patch with open admiration. Will this stay here forever? He asked, tilting his head toward Henry. Henry took a slow step forward until he was standing right beside the boy. He rested his palm lightly on the edge of the frame, the gesture soft enough not to smudge the glass, but firm enough to show he meant every word. It stays, he said, so you'll remember kindness before judgment. Lucas nodded, absorbing the lesson, with a seriousness that looked almost grown, though he was still very much a child, trying to understand the world, one quiet truth at a time. Around them, the townspeople began to clap, not loudly, but warmly, the way a porch swing creaks in approval on a breezy evening. The sound filled the foyer with something gentle and enduring. Respect, gratitude, legacy, all of it lingering in the golden air. A neighbor approached to shake Henry's hand. Another placed a hand over her heart. A third simply whispered, "Thank you," as though the words belonged to the moment rather than the speaker. Henry nodded to each of them, steady and humble, as if accepting gratitude on behalf of something larger than himself. Maybe he was. The sun shifted slightly, catching the patch just right. The threads glimmered faint, almost shy, yet unmistakably alive in the amber glow. It was as if the years stitched into it were shining through, offering one last quiet salute of their own. And there, in that small foyer filled with neighbors, warm light, and a legacy framed for the town to keep the meaning of service settled into place, steady, unspoken, and enduring. If this story moved you, share it forward. The foyer glowed in the late-day quiet sunlight, settling over the framed patch like a gentle blessing, and Henry stood beside it with the steadiness of a man who had spent a lifetime choosing kindness before credit. People passed through the small space, leaving brief touches of gratitude. A hand on his shoulder, a nod, a soft thank you. And still he simply smiled, as if the moment itself belonged more to the town than to him. It struck Lucas that Henry's service was like a lamp in a winter window. Modest, constant, meant to guide others rather than shine for itself. Then, as the boy stepped closer to read the small plaque beneath the glass, he felt something shift quietly. The room went still, and in that warm hush, the legacy settled in place, reminding everyone that respect once learned lasts longer than any judgment.